Welcome back, everyone, as we continue our look at Part 2 of Historia Civilis' Congress of Vienna. If you have not seen my reaction to the first section of Part 2 or any of my reaction to Part 1, those links are in the description below, as well as the link to the original content. Definitely check them out. I consider them one of the best history-related channels on this platform. It's well-researched, well-presented, and very in-depth. If you want to learn more about a topic, definitely check them out. Give them a subscription. Let's go ahead and dive into the next part of this. Where we left off, Talleyrand just had a meeting with Tsar Alexander of Russia, where Tsar Alexander basically said, give me what I want, or it's war. We've been talking all along about how crazy Tsar Alexander is and how he's the wild card in all of this. And as many of you pointed out, kind of foreshadowing what's to come here, even though the others are all going to kind of gang up and say, no, we're not going to let this guy have his way, Tsar Alexander's got a powerful enough country just in terms of manpower and size that throwing the word war around after the wars that everybody's just been through is in the end going to be enough to get him pretty much everything he wants.
When Metternich learned of Alexander's outburst, he finally lost his patience. He decided to meet once more with the Russian Tsar, this time with a different negotiating tactic. He told Alexander that Austria was considering unilaterally selecting a Polish king to rule over an independent Poland. This was an unspoken threat. Metternich was telling Alexander that all he had to do was snap his fingers, and Poland would rise up against Russian occupation. Alexander responded by issuing an unspoken threat of his own. He invited Metternich to come to Poland and inspect the Russian soldiers stationed there. All 200,000 of them.
A show of power.
Metternich then dropped the subtlety. He flatly told Alexander that if he took Poland, the entire Congress of Vienna would be against him. After this, tempers flared, voices were raised, and things got personal. From this moment on, Metternich would refuse to be in the same room with the Russian Tsar unless others were present, which frankly is exactly the kind of grudge that I respect. And then a very troubling thing happened. Without notice, the Russian soldiers in Saxony began to pull back and leave. Shortly after this, the Prussian soldiers occupying parts of Poland did the same. All of a sudden, there was a lot of military movement, and nobody knew why. Within a matter of weeks, a lot more Prussian soldiers entered Saxony, and a lot more Russian soldiers entered Poland.
Now, it's interesting because 100 years later, when you have a very similar scenario where you have a buildup on the border, it basically means war. I mean, in 1914, the mobilization of these troops was akin to a declaration of war. Now, we're not there yet, and these troops are already in the field. But you've got a buildup happening on the border, and that is a recipe for something to go wrong, where while you're trying to negotiate, something could happen with all of that going on that could take the negotiations completely out of your hands and lead to war before you realize what's happening.
It became clear that there was some kind of handoff happening, a secret agreement between Russia and Prussia.
There you go.
Both were openly fortifying their positions and preparing for war. Bad, bad, bad. Castlereagh wrote a summary of these events to Prime Minister Liverpool back in Britain. Quote, "Unless the Emperor of Russia can be brought to a more moderate and sound course of public conduct,
good luck.
The peace, which we have so dearly purchased, will be but of a short duration. You must make up your mind to watch him and resist him if necessary, as another Bonaparte." Back in Britain, the domestic political situation was approaching a boiling point. The narrow Conservative Whig majority in the House of Commons was in jeopardy. The liberal Whig opposition had weaponized the Saxony and Poland crisis, and were using it as a rallying cry against authoritarianism everywhere.
And this is something that happens in history, is that you're trying to deal with a major foreign policy crisis, and the party that is not in power back home uses that as an opportunity to try and get that power. It's happened throughout history. A couple of examples where it didn't happen. One example was in the American Civil War, where you have the United States holding congressional elections in 1862 and then a congressional and presidential election in 64, right in the middle of being at war with itself, a civil war. And there was a very real danger that if the party that was out of power, in this case the Democrats, took power, that everything they had tried to do in terms of prosecuting that war was going to be thrown out the window. And so it was a real crisis. At the end of World War II, you have Winston Churchill voted out of office right as they're about to win against Japan, just after victory in Europe. So, these are things that have to be considered. You're trying to deal with a foreign policy crisis. In this case, the British are not only dealing with the Congress of Vienna, they're dealing with the Treaty of Ghent and wrapping up the War of 1812, and now they've got to deal with this stuff at home too.
The liberals had the public on their side, and now they were calling for an independent Saxony and an independent Poland, with no concessions to the other powers whatsoever. Liverpool was in a precarious situation, and could not appear to be throwing the people of Poland to the Russian wolves, or bears or whatever. The liberals wanted to paint Liverpool as sympathetic to the Russian tyrant, and so Liverpool needed to prove them wrong. He wrote to Castlereagh, instructing him to back away from any deal that would partition Saxony or Poland. The official British position would now call for full independence for both countries.
So you can see they're going to extremes. Initially, there was talk of compromise. Okay, well, we've got to preserve part of their territory, but if you take some, all right. But now you've got the Russians going to the extreme position of, we're taking all of Poland. You've got now the British saying, under no circumstances can there be anything but an independent Saxony and Poland. You've got Austria with their desires as far as Saxony and Poland go. So something's got to give here. But as people go to more extreme positions, it's going to become harder and harder for there to be a compromise.
You would think that such an abrupt shift in priorities would blow up the negotiations, but it really didn't. After being stabbed in the back by Russia and Prussia, Metternich felt no obligation to bend over backwards for them anymore. The Austrian emperor had always wanted an independent Saxony, and Metternich had always wanted an independent Poland, so he joined the British in calling for both. Talleyrand had always favored full independence for both countries, and quickly followed Metternich's lead. This audacious show of force from Russia and Prussia spooked every small and medium-sized state in Central Europe. If Saxony could get steamrolled like this, nobody was safe. Virtually every Central European state found their courage and backed Castlereagh and Metternich's call for an independent Saxony and an independent Poland. Austria had long sought to position itself as the defender of precedent and tradition and the rule of law, and now that strategy was paying off. Metternich suddenly found himself at the center of attention, the most popular guy in Vienna, the hub to which every Central European state wanted to attach itself. When the dust settled, it became clear that Russia and Prussia's power grab had been a massive blunder. Tsar Alexander must have realized that he had backed himself into a corner, because he began sending signals to Austria that he might be satisfied with less than 100% of Poland.
Give me 99% and I'll be okay. You can have an independent Poland, a little one. Now, this is where you have one of those moments where you've got to make a decision. Do I double down on what I've been going down the road of, which is using military force and a threat of force to get what I want? Do I stick to my guns on that, and do I actually follow through then and say, well, come and take it if you want Poland? Or do I say, you know what, I tried this strategy, it didn't work, maybe it's time to do something different. But then the next time you threaten military force, people already know you're going to back down. So these are difficult decisions to make, and it's interesting to see how it all plays out based on how they choose to act.
This was exactly the sort of opening that everyone was waiting for. Attention then turned to Prussia. There were reports that Prussia was building fortifications inside of occupied Saxony, which drew broad international condemnation. It soon became conspicuous that Tsar Alexander was remaining silent. Prussia was being left hanging out to dry. A desperate Hardenberg visited Talleyrand and tried to get him to break away from the other powers by making wild promises. At one point, Hardenberg offered France the Netherlands, which of course was a red line for Britain, and not something that Hardenberg was in a position to give away.
Yep.
Talleyrand wisely turned him down. Hardenberg was out of options.
Nowhere else to go.
He backed down from his maximalist position and began telling people that he would accept no less than half of Saxony. Metternich jumped at this. An independent Saxony at half of its current size would satisfy both the Austrian Emperor and all of those smaller Central European states.
Never mind, Saxony's losing half its territory. Let's not miss that in all of this, is that everybody's talking about it like it's, oh, no big, yeah, okay, you can have half of it. You know, like, imagine if everybody in your neighborhood decided to invade someone's house, and then in the aftermath, they said, well, you can keep half your stuff. I mean, how would you feel in that case?
After some back and forth over specifics, an agreement was reached. Prussia would receive half of Saxony, along with some German-speaking territory along the Rhine. A reduced Saxony would remain fully independent, and war would be averted.
What's left of it?
But then there was still the issue with Poland. Alexander reopened negotiations by offering to let Austria and Prussia keep their Polish-speaking provinces, a real change of tune from last time. Castlereagh then called for the creation of a strong Polish constitution built upon liberal democratic values. Tsar Alexander immediately agreed and publicly thanked Castlereagh for his advocacy on behalf of the people of Poland.
Oh,
if you find Alexander's change in demeanor a little shocking, you aren't alone. It's clear that there were some back-channel talks going on during the Saxony crisis.
See, we're only seeing what's happening in the Congress of Vienna, what's happening down in Vienna and Austria during all of this. There's obviously other stuff going on outside of Vienna that he's kind of been hinting at the whole time, especially between Prussia and Russia. You know, Alexander's playing all his cards, using all the different options that he's got available to him. And for him to have taken such a hard line for so long, and then suddenly to just say, oh, all right, cool, no problem, you have to know something's up if you're a wise diplomat.
And it seems that concessions were made in order to get Alexander to back off and throw Prussia under the bus. What was happening now over Poland seemed well choreographed, as if it had all been drawn up in some back room somewhere.
Yep.
The great powers quickly reached an agreement over Poland, and it looked like this. Austria and Prussia would be allowed to keep their Polish-speaking provinces. The rest would become the Kingdom of Poland. The new kingdom would have a strong liberal democratic constitution, with an independent legislature, independent courts, and an independent army. The King of Poland would be a quasi-ceremonial role, tightly constrained by the Polish constitution. Under this deal, it was decided that Tsar Alexander of Russia would separately and simultaneously become the King of Poland.
There you go.
On paper, this satisfied the British and Austrian demands for an independent Poland.
Now, you have other examples of this. Obviously, Austria-Hungary is an example where you have the Emperor of Austria, also the King of Hungary. At one time, before they were joined as one government, you had the King of England, also the King of Scotland. They were joined under a joint union, but they were separate countries, and that's kind of what they're going for here. But you can't think for a second that Alexander's just going to sit back and just be a ceremonial head of Poland.
Since the new kingdom retained the right to make its own laws and field its own military, it also satisfied Alexander's demand to take Poland as a prize for defeating Napoleon. But obviously, Poland could not be truly independent under this arrangement.
Nope.
With the Russian emperor as their king, it became impossible for Poland to resist creeping Russian influence. For the rest of Alexander's reign, he would chip away at Poland's independent political institutions and slowly work towards swallowing Poland into the Russian Empire. By the time his successor came to the throne, the new Russian emperor declared that he no longer felt bound by the Polish constitution.
There you go.
And then that was that.
I think that's Nicholas.
It's undeniable that Castlereagh and Metternich sacrificed Poland for an independent Saxony. Perhaps they saw the writing on the wall. The truth was that if Russia took Poland by force, Austria and Britain really weren't in a position to take it back. Perhaps they decided that if they couldn't stop Russia from taking Poland, they could turn the whole thing into a poison pill. As an island of liberalism within the Russian Empire, Poland would confound and distract Tsar Alexander for the rest of his reign. The Poland and Saxony crisis brought the great powers back to the brink of war. But now that there was a deal in place, messy as it was, there was finally room to breathe. One of the conditions attached to the Poland deal was that Tsar Alexander, having received his great prize, was to get out of the way and let everybody else negotiate what they came to negotiate. There were still several outstanding questions that needed to be settled, but none more pressing than the fate of the German-speaking states in Central Europe.
So let's just take a minute and think about where we are in history. We're talking 1815. So we're about 50 years away from when Otto von Bismarck's going to start to move Germany into a place where it can become a unified empire. You're going to have the Schleswig-Holstein War, you're going to have the war with Austria, and then it's all going to culminate with the Franco-Prussian War, where the aftermath of that is going to be a united Germany under an emperor who is also the king of Prussia. So we're about 50 years away from that, but we're going to see a lot of what's going to lead them down that path developing here.
Metternich was the chair of the German Committee, and now that the crisis over Poland was resolved, he was finally able to get some real work done. Recall that the Congress of Vienna had agreed to use the 1792 borders as a starting point for negotiations. Well, in 1792, the Holy Roman Empire existed. Metternich had no interest in turning back the clock.
Which is interesting because his emperor of Austria was the Holy Roman Emperor.
The Roman Empire had proved itself to be a totally inept institution when faced with a real threat. The German Committee had the task of figuring out what Central Europe would look like in a post-Holy Roman Empire world. As far as Metternich could see, there were 4 possible paths forward. Option number 1, complete independence for everybody. Option number 2, a German empire united under one government. Option number 3, a loose confederation of German states. Option number 4, Austria and Prussia expand and conquer their smaller neighbors.
Yeah, I mean, you already see Prussia and their willingness to gobble up their German neighbors in what they've done with taking so much of Saxony. It is not difficult to imagine that if you're looking at this as one of the non-Prussian great powers, that's a real concern, is that Austria and Prussia, as the Central European German powers, are just going to eventually gobble up all those other ones. And so how do you prevent that? What do you put in place? If you give them complete independence, I would think that my concern in that situation is, well, all of these smaller powers, if you're one of those smaller powers and you're afraid of being gobbled up, you're going to ally yourself with one of the other powers in order to get some kind of protection, some kind of guarantee. If you create an empire, well, a lot of people have to give up their autonomy, give up their authority. If you create a loose confederation, maybe that's a happy medium. That's kind of what you already had, though, with the Holy Roman Empire. So all of these choices, you can see the negatives of them. So we'll see.
All 4 of these options presented problems. If they decided to go with option number 2, a united German empire, Metternich would obviously insist upon a Habsburg emperor.
Yep.
But given recent experience over Saxony, Metternich did not believe that the Prussians would submit to the Austrians like that.
No way.
In addition to that, Metternich was getting signals from Castlereagh that the British would not sign off on the creation of a German empire. So option number 2 seemed a dead end. Option number 4, Austria and Prussia conquering their neighbors, didn't seem great either. Such aggressive behavior would frighten all the other great powers, and if any of them tried to protect one of the smaller German states, they would all be at war again. That left option number 1 or option number 3, either complete independence or a loose confederation. Of the two, Metternich's preference was for a loose confederation. He thought that complete independence would leave Central Europe weak and unable to defend itself. It would only be a matter of time until some outside power went to war with one of Austria's weaker neighbors. And then Austria would intervene, and then we're back in a great power conflict situation. A loose confederation, on the other hand, might be enough to deter meddling from outside powers.
But that's what you already had. So
if
what does
there
it
was
look
to
like?
be a German confederation, Metternich would first need to mend the relationship with Hardenberg. The Prussian duplicity over Saxony had left a sour taste in everyone's mouth, but if the two great powers were to live under the same umbrella, they would have to be friends. Metternich began making his pitch to some of the smaller German states. He found very little resistance. Many felt burned over the Saxony debacle and sought a closer strategic relationship with Austria for their own protection.
So they're looking at this as, look at what Prussia did to Saxony. We're not going to be the next victims of Prussia, so they're kind of siding with Austria here, which is kind of what I was already kind of thinking out loud there a few minutes ago, is that when you're a smaller power, you gotta cozy up to one of the big powers for protection.
Metternich's vision for a German confederation would look like this. All states within the confederation would maintain their independence, except when it came to matters of military defense. Under the German confederation, an attack on one would be an attack on all.
That's basically NATO, right? I mean, in the post-war era of World War II, you have the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. You have a similar thing happen with the Warsaw Pact. And it was all these European powers plus Canada, United States, a few others, saying an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. And so you could not have a situation like you did in World War II where Germany was going to attack someone without there immediately being 20 countries that jumped in on their behalf. So that's kind of what's happening here. So it's amazing the number of ways in which we see foreshadowing of the 20th century unfolding here in the early part of the 19th century.
Any outside power sticking their nose into German affairs would be met with the combined strength of every German state. This ruffled some feathers, because it restricted the ability of German states to make alliances with outside powers. Bavaria in particular was upset by this, but Metternich soothed things over by pointing out that this would put them in a military alliance with 38 other German states. Such a thing had not been possible under the Holy Roman Empire, and such a thing would not be possible to anybody out there negotiating on their own. Of course, Austria and Prussia were to be exempt from this. They had their own goofy reasoning. They had non-German provinces within their respective empires. Whatever. The real reason is that they were great powers and reserved the right to make alliances or war as they wished.
And there's an interesting point to be made there too, where he talks about how there were reasons that were given, but then there were the real reasons. And a lot of times, this is true in life, and this is true in diplomacy, it's true in business, it's true in all sorts of areas of life. A lot of times, the reason is not the reason. There's the stated reason, and then there's the real reason. And more often than not, people understand the real reason, no matter what you say.
Austria and Prussia would be the two anchors of the German Confederation, and it was paramount to the survival of the Confederation that the two great powers within it got along. The German Confederation would have a central diet, a legislature, located in the free city of Frankfurt. The Diet was conceived as a sort of United Nations of Germany, where various independent German states would come together and resolve any disputes that might lead to war. They would also work to reduce barriers so that Germans could live and work and write in any German-speaking country without fear.
Kind of like
To
an
this
early
end,
EU.
They created a weak federal legal system to protect certain political rights across borders. Hardenberg of Prussia was surprisingly supportive of this proposal. The German Diet treated Austria and Prussia as equal partners, which was reassuring to an insecure and young power such as Prussia.
All right, so we're going to wrap it up right there before we get into the next part of this. There's 20 minutes to go, so we'll do the last reaction tomorrow of this series. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you guys have too. Please add to the conversation down below. Let's learn together about this topic. Hope you've enjoyed it. Hit that like button if you would. Thanks for watching.